Let's talk about OpenTelemetry's API and SDKs. I thought it's pretty straightforward, but there's a lot of details involved with it, and it's really interesting to understand some of the basics before actually getting on to the instrumentation part. I got really intrigued by how much information that I could get on this one, and I thought I would share with all of you. In order to understand this concept better, I thought I'd go back to basics and use a simple book app example. If you can see, I got all these details that I want to do on my book application, list all the books, get details of one specific book, update a book, and so on. So these are your get and post requests. So I'll be using RESTful commands to perform my operations. And as you can see, that a client sends a get request and the server responds back with a JSON object as expected. Now, imagine if somebody has to implement this into your particular application, which would look something like this one. You import a request library, and then you need to actually do a request.get and process the output. It's basically just note that you're not doing any kind of HTTP retries handling or error handling or maybe even caching. But with SDKs, that's the benefit. Again, the things that you are doing is very low level, whereas SDK uh, is giving the devs much more flexibility and comfort in terms of specific programming languages. For example, we have SDK for Java, Python, and so on. So in here, the same operation can be done using list books, whereas that list book implementation is handling all of the other details that I talked about. That's the benefit of using SDKs. And this is the full list of implementation for this book app using an SDK. So if this concept is clear to you, let's move on to APIs and SDK in OpenTelemetry. Again, so here I got a bit confused when they said we need to install OpenTelemetry-API and OpenTelemetry-SDK. So these are in PyPy and you can install it using pip. So that's when the confusion arose. Why not use the requests and do this? Why am I had to install the package for APIs? And these API, OpenTelemetry-API packages are there for each programming languages. Like Python has its own and Java its own and so on. Now, now I got the benefits of why we have to do that. I'll talk about that. Now, if you look at the implementation for the APIs in OpenTelemetry, you would see something like this, whereas once you're installed the library, obviously you're coming in here, importing the trace, getting a tracer handler, and you are just starting the trace. But there's nothing happening here. This is a no op, and the APIs are mainly used by the libraries, like I said. And this isn't doing anything as long until you have some exporter like Yager or any backend of your choice on the cloud. So SDK actually is a full-fledged implementation. So SDK actually implements the API plus the other definitions defined in the OpenTelemetry framework itself, like the specifications. Now let's take a look at the SDK now. So as you can see, the SDK is actually giving you some more details about uh, the console span exporter, which is where it wants to export the traces, and it is also defining the exporters in this case. So SDK provides the concrete implementation. It's installed and configured by your app owners, but it's not used by the instrumentation libraries. Whereas APIs are mostly used by the instrumentation libraries. Now, if you ask me why use APIs and SDKs, it could be pretty straightforward why you use it, but let's take a dig at it and understand this better. Let's look at this particular OpenTelemetry architecture. Um, so we got three signals at the top: tracing, metrics, and baggage. I'll talk about baggage. It's a key value pair, includes some more metadata within the context. So that metadata actually travels from one span to another, and and it stays within the context. For example, if you want to track a user ID or some other details about the user, you add that in your trace context, which actually is preserved. But do remember, and I also got to know about this, that this will not get stored into Jaeger or any of your backend unless you explicitly say that to do so. There's also something like a span event, which actually logs some of the details within that span context. For example, if you want to log some errors which happened within that span, that can be done using add event. And it is a span, current span specific, but that is not carried forward within the context. So that's a subtle difference between the two. But if you look at it, there is a shared subsystem called as context propagation that is being used by all three signals here. And and if you want to know this better, you need to understand what is a cross-cutting concern. Cross-cutting concern is nothing but, let's imagine if you have an application which has multiple tiers, starting from application to your framework middleware and going back to the database, and you're instrumenting every piece of the layer here. That becomes a cross-cutting concern. And and how do we mitigate how, and this is also uh, going against the separation of concern rule, right? And how does open telemetry helps to actually mitigate this problem? So there's a good news on this front, because open telemetry, if you look at the bottom part here, it defines your semantic conventions, APIs, SDKs. There is also a Contrib library, which is a third-party contributions like Flask, Django, and other instrumentation libraries, which we can use within our application code to auto-instrument our code and fetch more details with regards to all the calls that enters and exits the system. So that's basically what is OpenTelemetry architecture at a high level. So what we are trying to do is mitigating these concerns about, I mean, it makes this flexible. It's getting that flexibility, decoupling, and it avoids the code duplication part as well. So that's essentially what it does. Let's take a look at a couple of more concepts before we wrap this up. So the one is semantic conventions, which is pretty straightforward. It is a constant or a environment variable or a key value pair, whatever you might want to call it. It defines a standard. For example, in here we are defining a standard attribute name as HTTP URL. It could be HTTP status code. There could be HTTP method here, get or post. So using this said standards, we can search within Jaeger to fetch the appropriate results, cut across different layers within your entire application. That's essentially what it means. So always recommend, highly recommend to use semantic conventions rather than creating your own first code check. If there is anything, any constant that is already there that you can make use of. And then the Contrib is all your third-party libraries, which comes as a package again, like Flask, Django, SQL Alchemy, etc. These are pre-built integrations. And let's say if you are building a library for MySQL instrumentation, you should, again, coming back to this, you should only depend on API, not the SDK. That way your library works no matter what exporters is used. App developers choose how to implement export telemetry. Open telemetry actually avoids tight coupling and makes your libraries easy to integrate. If you look at Contrib in action, that's how you are instrumenting the Flask here, and then all the all the routes will be automatically instrumented. For example, in this case, let's imagine this particular route is already part of the trace, and then you are starting another span within that particular parent, and then that's how it knows the trace context and the trace ID, and then it automatically brings this as part of one complete trace rather than separate traces. That's the advantage of using this particular function, start as current span. Now, we covered a lot. We made it this far. There was a lot of ground that we covered in this video. Just to recap, we started off with APIs and SDKs. took a few basic example, and then we got into how OpenTelemetry differs from this thing. And we also understood the OpenTelemetry architecture a little bit more, understood the cross-cutting concerns and how OpenTelemetry mitigates some of these challenges like separation of concerns and so on. Finally, we understood how Contrib packages works and semantic conventions are defined. So let's take a time to reflect on these, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.